a sec. And I'll let people trickle in as they want.
Do we use taking?
Alright. Hi everyone. Seminar time. Hi. I know some of you, I also don't know some of you, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Oscar. I used to do a lot more debating until this year, where I got a full-time job, and so I'm not doing much debating. My credentials to give this seminar are that I steadfastly, through an entire career of debating, pretty much refused to speak anything but first. I went to 4 Australs and 2 Worlds and 2 Easters in which I spoke first at both my Worlds, first and applied at all of my Australs, and then at the Easters that I actually did okay and broke at, I spoke first, even though I was the pro on the team. So clearly I refuse to do rebuttal, but I think that means that I have some idea about first, and I want to give a bit of a take on first speaking. And I have a couple of aspirations, I suppose, with this seminar. I remember this time of the year well, which is just everyone's got their Australs teams and is excited about Australs. Many of you will be going to Australs for the first time or judging for the first time. Or if you've gone to Australs before, it's the first time that you can expect to be actually competitive at Australs. So it's an exciting time and everyone's in new different teams and wow, how fun. And I remember at this particular time of the year, there's also this like power struggle that happens in a lot of newly formed Australs teams about speaking first. And sometimes it might be that multiple people on the team want to speak first. I think everyone knows that's less common. It's more common that no one wants to speak first, and you have this kind of bizarre stick-swinging power struggle about who has to speak first and who reluctantly ends up speaking first. So this seminar is a bit pitched at the person who has reluctantly ended up speaking first, even though they don't really want to. And I'm hoping that it will be informative if that's you. But I guess my secondary goal is to try and sell you on first as a fun position that has a lot to it and a lot of nuance and things to appreciate aesthetically about it. So if you are in a position of having to speak first and not really being that happy about it, that you might reframe that after the seminar. I mean, maybe you won't, I don't know, but I'll try. Okay. That being said, I think this seminar is pretty conversational, anecdotal, personal. So feel free to interrupt me and ask a question at any point. I have organized this as essentially every time that I in my debating career kind of ran into a roadblock and wasn't improving for a while, asking myself why that happened, and then improvements that I consciously made. And so I'll talk about those things as they come up. So I figure that good lessons about how to do things come from when you failed at them and then you learn from it. So I guess that's the way I'm pitching this seminar, is common pitfalls of fast and then constructive strategies to avoid them. I've also organized them into kind of broad themes. So there's 11 tips in this seminar, and then there are under 3 themes. The first is that I think first speaking should be best understood as a confidence trick. And what I mean by that is basically fooling the judge. And understanding that first speaking involves you being in this kind of dance with the adjudicator, where you have to preempt all the thoughts they're going to have about what you're going to say before you say it, and then deliver your thoughts in the way that is most likely to land with that judge. And sometimes that means, you know, speaking differently depending on the judge you have, but more often I think it just means adopting a set of strategies that land with most people and land with most people's ways of processing information. So yeah, the first, I guess, general tip I have, and this is the most puntery tip in the whole presentation, I think, is that examples are good. And I think that the general trajectory of people in debating is as follows. They start in like primary primary school and year 7 and 8, and they use lots of examples because that's the easiest way that people understand unfamiliar topics, is they latch onto things they're familiar with. So they start speaking with lots of examples. And then at some point in that process, they realize that that's actually not analysis. Examples aren't a replacement for analysis. And they're coaches who are paid lots of money to tell them things like, you should use analysis, not examples, tell them that a lot, and so they stop using examples. And then sort of towards the end of high school, people start using way less examples in their first speeches and sort of replace it with abstract analysis because they're afraid of not mechanizing something properly, so they just kind of avoid examples. And I think people get to the point when they arrive early in university debating where they actually just kind of are example shy. Maybe that's not everyone, but I feel like that's the experience of many people. And so what I want to say is that you should use examples, and I listened to so many speeches where I really wish there were examples. And the person who told me this, that I was making this mistake, was one of the greats of the game, Imogen Harper, who I realize many of you don't actually know. Maybe you do, but she was Australs best speaker twice, and she judged our Australs trials a couple of years ago, and she told me, I'm shocked you're a first speaker because your third speech was so much better because of all the examples you used. And I really wish you, if you're going to speak first, if you insist on speaking first, that you would use more examples, which really made me rethink stuff. My take on how examples can be most useful is using them for only a couple of mechanisms in your whole speech. The mechanisms that you know are the most unintuitive, the mechanisms that you know are going to go down the hardest with the judge. Like really intuitive things probably, that are understood easily from a level of abstraction, probably don't need an example. But complex, multi-step logic pieces of mechanization, it's really useful to have an example to show how the flow of logic that you just explained actually looks in the real world. The other thing that I would avoid in example selection at first is just giving a list of examples. Sometimes people do this to hint at their subject matter credibility, and sometimes that's fine. They'll be like, oh, well, here's 5 wars that I know about that are relevant to this international relations topic that we're doing, and that should make you feel that every fact claim I make later in the speech is credible because I know 5 examples that I've just listed. And that's fine, I suppose, but I think the most useful instance of an example is to explain for like 45 seconds to a minute an example that really helps to make the judge believe a mechanism that they otherwise were going to discard that's important to your case. I find that the most useful way to know when examples should be deployed and to have examples to deploy is to read like really long form articles, like articles that take 30 to 45 minutes to read. And both because this will be interesting reading material that will give you examples to use in your debating speeches, but I actually think more pertinently than that, they're structured in a way that's pretty similar to a debating speech, and they can give you a sense of the flow of when digressing into an illustration is most useful. Because those people do it for a profession, so they're really good at it. So yeah, that's examples. Next, don't bury the lead. Now, obviously everyone, or at least I assume everyone at this point in debating, titles their arguments. And the point of this slide is not to say you should have titles for your arguments. Obviously you should, but I would say that a lot of people have kind of crap titles that don't actually do anything for them. They have titles like, my first point is about how this will damage the economy of China. And I'm sure that that is an impact that will result from that point. But actually, it doesn't do much to tell me what's going to happen in that argument, what proof will be given, what the overall strategic importance of that argument is. So I think people are a bit lazy with titles. I think the best titles are kind of if-then statements, which provide a roadmap of the strategic importance of the point. For example, if I prove X claim, obviously it's debate specific, then Y thing will be true, and then for that reason we will have to win the debate because they can't win if that's true. And I think that provides a much clearer roadmap of where a point is going than just like a title that kind of hints at one of the impacts of the argument, which is what a lot of people do. I think the rationale for this is you want to make yourself easy to track. So if you give a clear roadmap of where the point is going in the first like 30 seconds or like 3 sentences, the judge will probably write that down in their notes, and they can easily slot bits of material that you deliver into that, which means they won't forget to note things down, and when they go to review the notes from your speech, it'll be much more clearly structured, which means they're more likely to remember it. But also it generates early buy-in to the argument because, you know, once they buy into the concept of the point from the beginning, everything that you say afterwards makes more sense. And so they believe it more. Finally, I think this is also useful for an internal point of view, as in, I often, and this will be a theme throughout this presentation, struggled with time management when I was actively speaking. And so sometimes at first you're going to have to discard an impact that is nice to say but it's not vital, or a mechanism that's nice to say but not vital. And I find that writing out a roadmap of your point, or an executive summary of your point, makes it clear to you which things can be discarded if you need to budget time in the middle of your speech, and which things you can't. Or which things are most critical and therefore the most worthwhile spending time on them. Which means you'll time manage better, I think, if you do this with speeches. Okay, next thing. Sorry, these are also country, but these are things I feel passionate about. Script your introductions, and ideally your conclusions, but definitely your introductions. For a while, I thought it was a bit of a dying art to structure one's introduction. I feel like most people don't do it, or they did it in a very generic way, where they would just like kind of ad-lib the titles of their points and then get straight into the speech. But my opinion is that it's really psychologically useful, both for you and a judge, to start strong, to start with like easy ground where you know you're not going to stumble, and end in a punchy way that's scripted and planned. I think there are lots of valid ways to do an introduction. If you're first negative, there's a really valuable way to do an introduction, which is just a good rebuttal that deals with a major premise of the affirmative case and demonstrates that that point was missing from the affirmative case. Or you could use, as I said, an example that will be useful and save you a bunch of time in explaining a bunch of unintuitive mechanisms that you're going to say later in your speech, or that will affect the most complex claims in your speech and help those go down a bit easier and a bit more smoothly. Both of those are fine. I would say though that those are debate-specific ways to do introductions, and sometimes you'll be debating about finance law and you'll have zero passion about the topic, and you will not have a pithy rebuttal that will be easy and punchy to give at the beginning of your speech to first affirmative. And so in these cases, it's perfectly valid, even though it's boring, to just say your win conditions slowly and clearly. Even if it just means you are scripting your like title of your speech where you're like, I have 3 points, I will do 3 things in this speech. I feel like that's not nevertheless worthwhile as opposed to just kind of ad-libbing it. I would say try to avoid pretending that you're personally invested in a topic when you're not, because I think that's possibly the worst way to start a speech, because you can just tell when someone is affecting passion, and it really kills your credibility for the rest of your speech. Psychologically, the judge is right, I think. Okay, next. Integrate freestanding chunks of analysis into longer chains of reasoning. And this is a bit of a word salad, but what I mean by this, and obviously this will, if you've never done VP, this will make more sense when you do VP, and I think it's actually maybe better advice for speaking first in VP, but it still is relevant to Australs, especially when you're really evenly matched against another team, is you should try and insulate your points against being entirely discarded. And my first world was Vietnam world, which I think, to be candid, I expected to break at. I didn't expect, like win the tournament or whatever, but I expected to break. and missed the break by 1 point. So if you get 17 points, you break at Worlds. Didn't manage that one. And so I was pretty upset, obviously. Like, you know, you fly to Vietnam, you spend some money, you don't break. That's sad. And so I did a bit of soul searching after this tournament about what went wrong for me and my partner Nicola at this tournament. And we started, you know, the first half of the tournament pretty well. We were on 12 out of 15, took them with gas, love it. And then, as you can see, the wheels kind of fell off for us in the final 4 rounds, and we just missed the break. And what I realized was, at this point in my debating life, I was kind of going all in on things, especially at closing, which, again, I realized Australs format doesn't have closing, but what I was doing at closing was I was giving these member speeches that would have one title and like one big idea, and then everything I said under that idea was in service of proving the thesis of the speech. And that's a great way to come first in BP, to spend 7 minutes proving one thing and have the judge believe it. Because that's probably a world in which you've explained something fully and impacted it and weighed it properly. And most people will forget to do that in BP. So I think there was some logic to it that, you know, when I was better than other people in the room, I was doing work great at closing and coming first a lot because I was focusing and delivering one piece of analysis. But when I was getting to rooms that were really challenging, like round 6 of Worlds, where we hit multiple teams that made the grand final that year, it was crap when we were closing because actually the ideas were a lot riskier and were a lot more risky of the judge just discarding the point entirely and saying, no, I don't agree with that idea. And when I spent my entire speech trying to prove one idea, and that idea was discarded, well, there's kind of no other position you can come in for. And so, if you've been to Worlds or you're familiar with the format, the worst possible thing you can do at Worlds is to come fourth. You need to get 2 firsts to compensate for a fourth, which is pretty hard to do. So you've got to avoid it. And if you're doing it twice in the final 4 rounds of the tournament, no bueno. So you've got to do what people call soliciting the sausage sometimes, which is going for a third or going for a second. And sometimes in the Australs format, when you're about to spend 2.5 minutes on a pretty risky argument, you've got to insulate your speech and that argument against the judge thinking it's stupid. So I think this mentality works best if you're the kind of speaker who prefers to have an argument with like 3 detailed mechanisms as opposed to 7 kind of scattergun ones, which is always the way I prefer to be. And you can think about each individual mechanism and think about if that mechanism can generate its own impacts outside of the impacts the whole point is in service of. And I think that's the easiest way to come up with sausage soliciting strategies or to insulate the overall and big thesis of an argument against the judge saying it's crap. And I would encourage people to really think about that every time they're making an argument, the way that it can be salvaged. Especially as next semester you transition into BP, this will be a critical difference. There'll be plenty of situations that you'll whinge a lot about you know, opening half took everything and we have to try and come third at closing. And there's no way we can do worse. Sorry, there's no way we can do better than third. And this is probably the only way that you'll get much out of speaking substantive closing in that sense. I put an example here, which I won't explain in detail, but this was a speech where I felt like I had a eureka moment of actually being able to achieve this in a really hard CG. And that's nice, you know, when you notice a problem in your speaking and then you fix it. I encourage you to have those moments, it's fun. The thing about insulating points, even if actually the judge buys it mostly, it's psychologically harder for a judge to discount an entire point if you're giving them lots of exit routes. If you're saying, okay, I understand you might not buy this whole thing, but here's a contained bit of the argument that you can buy, right? And then here's another contained bit of the argument that you can buy, and then here's another contained bit of the argument you can buy, which makes it really hard for the judge to say that point's terrible and I won't believe it at all when you've given them so much to think about, which makes it harder to give you a loss, which is ideally what we want. Okay, That's it. Any questions at this point? Otherwise, I'm just like, yeah.
How do you insulate arguments, or I suppose mechanisms that are wholesale dismissed based on changing characterizations? It's kind of similar to like tip 4, like the ground changes.
As in the mechanism is reliant on characterization.
This is just very selfishly. I find that a lot of the time I'll make an argument and it'll rely on, or I feel like it won't rely that heavily on characterization, but then when the characterization changes, that is usually the reasoning or rationale for why that argument then gets discredited.
I think it's most useful to explicitly explain why mechanisms are not characterization contingent. Especially if you think that's a risk. Like, I mean, it's a bit hard because every decision you make at first comes at opportunity cost. So if you're spending 30 seconds explaining why a mechanism isn't characterization contingent, then maybe that's wasted time if they were never going to contest the characterization, and so therefore wasn't worth doing. And so it's necessary to cultivate a skill over time of realizing what things will be contested before they will be, and explicitly acknowledging the likely form of the contest. And sometimes you fuck it up. I think no first speaker is perfect at predicting another team at how they're going to rebut an argument. But I think that's the best way to get better at first is to do that. Okay, I'm going to move on. Do we need this, Helen?
Yeah, for like 30 seconds. Wait, has anyone not signed up?
This is the signing in to the.
Gorgeous, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Next theme is accept and embrace that first can be a rule lover. And this is the most bitter bit of my presentation. I'll try and keep it brief. First tip, know when things can be said at second. I'm sure that you know that there are only a couple of things that the first speaker has to do. Set up and ideally characterization that every argument is contingent on. I think that in university debating, especially of late, people are kind of resistant to new substantive at second. They have this logic that goes like, well, if it's important, it should be said at first. And we're not going to say anything unimportant, so every argument should come out at first. And that I think is flawed for a number of reasons. But I think the most important reason is just you have 8 minutes at first. And you have some non-negotiable jobs which include not making arguments. So if you have 3 legitimate win strategies as a team, and you cram them all into the first speech, they'll all be done poorly. They'll all need to be rebuilt by your second speaker. They will all be contested, and that will put you on the back foot quite often. So I think it's worth there being a bit of a trend change toward people doing and planning for substantive to happen at second more. If you watch Australs debates from like 2013, it was incredibly routine for second speakers to have 1 or even 2 new pieces of substantive, which is why the generic feedback that probably everyone got when they were in year 7 was that second speakers should do 2 new points, because that's what people were doing at university at that point. But now everyone feels a bit cheated because they get to university and no one does substantive at second, or everyone does very small amounts or very niche substantive at second. My opinion is that as a first speaker, you should acknowledge and should push your teams towards doing more at second. There are some times where your second speaker knows the argument better, and you can help the characterization for that argument at first, but they'll explain it better at second. So don't waste 2 minutes explaining an argument you know they're going to re-explain. Your second speaker is going to re-explain it. That is my opinion. I think if you're in the position of choosing which material to not do in a first speaker speech, my recommendation would be to not do impacting. And ideally you do mechanization and impacting anyway, obviously. And if you forget to do that, your speaks will take a gigantic hit. But the result of the debate won't change that much if you forget to impact it first, because that's much more psychologically easy than the chain of logic for a well-mechanized point to be impacted later and then bought. But if you've impacted an argument that the judge doesn't believe, then it's going to be a really hard job for your second speaker to get up and mechanize it properly. So if you're in the position of needing to make a decision about what to do, what to leave to your second speaker, pretty much always the right decision is impacting, and pretty much never is the right decision mechanization. Of course. This is credited to a career of chronically poor time management. Next one. Gently but firmly manage your teammates. I have had the distinct pleasure of debating with some great debaters like Eugene and Charlie and Matt Toomey in my time at Native. And all of these people are very intense in the prep room, and I'm sure they would agree. And very different debaters. And everyone you debate with probably in any serious capacity is quite different, and they prep differently. But as a first speaker, you have to leave the prep room with a speech. They don't. Responsive speeches don't. And so you have a disproportionate role to mold prep and mold other people in your prep room's method of prepping in a way that suits you. However, you shouldn't be a dictator about this because everyone has different strengths that you should seek to harness. So, for example, the former two of this list of three were the kind of speakers who would emerge directly from brainstorm with a fully fleshed out case, chapter and verse, with titles and 5 mechanisms under each title, and a very clear picture of what they wanted me to say at the fastest. And those people would have a tendency, the moment brainstorm ended, to go on kind of an 8 to 10 minute soliloquy of what they thought about in brainstorm. Which meant that if you did 3 minutes of topic selection and 5 minutes of brainstorm, then 8 to 10 minutes of a Eugene or Toomey soliloquy, you've got 10 to 12 minutes left of prep at the end of that to think about how to structure the speech and how to deliver material and which material should go where. Which means you're often time constrained and the speech you deliver is disjointed. Which means that you kind of need to, well, I needed to, as someone who was giving their material as a first speaker, interrupt them a lot and be like, no, sorry, we need to think of what the headings are and what the case structure is before I let you soliloquize. And then I will let you talk. And coming into those kind of compromises is, I think, an essential part of being an effective first speaker. Realizing what your teammates' strengths and weaknesses are and then changing prep to adjust for that was important. Conversely, when I debated with Charlie last year at Australs, they are someone who does not emerge from brainstorm with a fully fleshed idea a lot of the time. And they'll be like minute 22 of prep out of 30, and they will suddenly have an entirely new argument that is very good and needs to be in the speech, and I need to understand it, and so I need to adapt to the fact that those kind of situations happen, and so I need to be more flexible with the way I write, and more flexible with the overall structure and attitude I have to my speech, to acknowledge the fact that we're in an Australs semi-final and I have 5 minutes before I need to get up, and we've got a new argument that I need to introduce into my speech. And so my recommendation, I suppose, to everyone who speaks first is just to consciously think about prep management and teammate management as a critical part of the game. Your preferences, I think, are the most significant, but other people's are too. So yeah, work that out. Have those conversations early. Tip 7, ignore your speaker scores. So I think speaks are fake and shit. Not to discount anyone who's done well in speaker tabs before, but I think they're very fickle, and I think they especially are fickle at first. The example that I come up with when I think about this is David Africa, who I think is perhaps the best debater of all time, maybe, at least by achievements he is. Like, he's won every tournament there is to win. And he won Australs undefeated in 2021 in Nepal. And he didn't make the top 10, even though if you watch speeches from that tournament, he was absolutely devastating. His speeches were, you know, the reason that team was winning so consistently, and they would have done meaningfully worse without him. I think that people need to, if they're gonna become lifelong or majors first speakers, accept that your speaks will take a hit by virtue of the fact you're speaking first, and you must measure your success and satisfaction you get out of speaking somewhere else than the speaker tab. Measure it by how much you help your team win. Measure it by, how good you feel about the speech. How easy you make the job of your teammates. Things like this, rather than the ranking of a result. Because while I'm grateful that I didn't go ever backwards, I would have liked to do better, and I don't think I would have been as happy with my Australs if I was purely just looking at that. Okay, final bit, which is entitled Begrudging Sublimations of My Essay's Tendencies, which are basically all the things that I didn't want to change about my first speaking and that I don't want to acknowledge are important to substantive, but I think are. The first is about how fast you should speak. And I have had many arguments with many people about how fast you should speak in debating. My take at the end of my career is this. I think there are two oppositional forces at play at first, most particularly, but in every position. One oppositional force is you have 8 minutes to explain the nuances of your arguments. That's almost never enough because they're too complex to really be given a lot of justice in 8 minutes. Which means that you have an impulse to speak really fast, so you can say a lot and probably get as close as you possibly can to doing an argument full justice, or a set of arguments full justice, which leans you towards speaking fast. And then there's another intuition, which is debating is a game judged by real people who need to be sincerely emotionally persuaded, and who need to understand the argument being made in order to credit it. This means that you probably have an upper limit of how fast you can speak at the very least, because if you speak too fast and they don't track it, well, that's worse than nothing. That's wasted time and they don't remember your speech, which is the worst possible outcome. So that's a pressure that pushes you in the opposite direction, towards speaking a bit slower. And I think that the conclusion that I've reached is that every moment and every speech demands a different level of speed. It demands you going through material at a different rate. And again, I think this is one of those cases where it really helps to have a long-term developed sixth sense of what arguments will be contested, what material will be the most difficult for a judge to believe, in order for you to make decisions about how fast you should speak. Because I think it's generally relatively safe to speed through mechanisms you know won't be contested on their factual accuracy, that are probably likely to be contested on how important they are maybe, and therefore that is best left to later speakers, and then you can rush through the explanation of it pretty fast at first. Or intuitive analysis that is best for a judge not to think too much about. That's good to go fast with. But there are also tons of other moments in speeches where you need to go slow. If your speech is contingent on you landing a pretty emotional kind of killer blow of impacting, sounding like a scattergun when you're delivering that is a credibility killer. And so too is going scattergun through an argument and affecting overconfidence about your mechanization of an argument that the judge is going to have trouble believing. Have intellectual humility that if you are able to think in the prep room, this argument is sketchy and it's going to be hard to believe, that the judge would probably think that too. And one, spend time thinking about what their likely grievances will be and try to address those, but also speak slowly and humbly to them to acknowledge the fact that you realize that the point is a bit difficult to buy and it's complex. Because I'm sure if you've been in the position of judging and you've seen, like an overconfident, perhaps a male speaker, deliver an argument that you're like, oh, come on. Like, surely you don't think this is as basic or as intuitive as you're presenting it to be, then that's a really negative headspace for you to be in about a speech, and you want to avoid your judges being in that position. So I guess this is not to say speak fast or speak slow. This is to say think about what is the most strategic speed to speak at, because obviously there are moments where both are valid and you need to adjust. Cool. Next. Ask your teammates to write bits of your speech for you. And again, this is, I feel, a basic piece of advice. I'm unsure if many people do this. I think some people have an intuition that this is bad, but my case for it is this. Sometimes the prep room is too chaotic, and you don't have that much time. And I was always someone, and I acknowledge not everyone is like this, who liked to have a lot written on my paper when I went up to speak, so that I never had a moment of sort of looking down at a page and seeing like 3 words from the next minute of my speech and getting lost. And so I would get really stressed, especially in BP when you have 15 minutes to prep, about not having enough written and not having enough detail on my paper. So a way for me to solve that problem was quite often when I was debating with my world's partner Nicola to ask her to write all of my impacting word for word, and I would just do the mechanisms. Or to write an entire point word for word, or close to word for word, and then I'd write another point. Clearly, this can only be effective if you have good prep dynamics with someone, and you quickly, like in the first 5 to 10 minutes, 5 minutes in BP or 10 minutes in 3v3, decide what the case is going to be, what the argument's going to be, and you both kind of have a general conception of what the arguments are, and there's a clear differential in who understands bits of arguments in the case better. For me, as I said, the easiest way that I found was very reliable in a partnership that I did for quite a long time was my partner was a lot better than me at impacting, and I was quite a bit better at mechanization. And so we would just divide that later in my own speech. And the advantages are a few following things. The first is obviously you divide later based on who gets things best, so you get the best of both speakers, like thinking and clarity right from the beginning, which is important at first. I think obviously probably that would come out anyway, if that, because the person who's writing your speech from like second or third is eventually going to get their own speech and going to get the opportunity to clarify something that you maybe explained imperfectly, but you avoid that problem of explaining something kind of shoddily at first and then having your second speaker fix it, if you explain it properly in the way they would have wanted it explained at first, and don't leave them the entire point to reconstruct. So I think it saves time on reconstruction and it is useful in that sense. I think it's also useful because you could pay more attention to specific word choices or speech strategy that you want to make. So the things that I've already talked about in the seminar, like choose your examples strategically. Think about when you should speed up and when you should slow down. Think about the roadmap of the argument. Think about those kinds of things. You have more time to think about and cogitate on those things, and to sense check your mechanisms or to sense check what you're saying when you're doing less. When you are only maybe doing the mechanisms, or you're only doing one of the 2 arguments, I think that is where you're able to genuinely ask yourself those questions. Thirdly, I think it's easier for responsive speakers to plan. Maybe it's the case that, you're only writing one argument, and then you're leaving them something else to do. At the very least, they know what work they have to do if you're getting stressed and you're asking them to write a bunch of stuff. And maybe you can just give them the things they wrote if you forget it, right? That was another thing that I quite often did. I'd leave the things Nicola wrote for my speech to last, and if I forgot to get to it, she would just say, because she already wrote it and she understood it. Which kind of saves them time as well, when you forget things. So, yeah, ask your teammates to write things for you. Try it out. Maybe it won't work for you, but I think it can work quite well. Finally, rebut and judge sometimes if you are a person who likes to speak first. And I'm not sure, are there a lot of people like that? I hope there are. But I hope at this point in the presentation that it's clear that the 2 skills that are critical to good first picking are forecasting the way an argument is going to be rebutted and forecasting how a judge will receive the argument. Because it allows you to plan for the way you preemptively deliver material, to insulate against potential rebuttals and to insulate against moments where judges are unlikely to believe something that you said. I think that the only way, so I think you can develop this skill by doing a lot of debating and speaking a lot of first, But I think you also probably do need to, if you aspire to be really good at this, put yourself in the judge seat, put yourself in the responding seat every now and then at regular intervals so you can understand what people reach for easily and what common critiques people have of arguments so that you can fix those before they get said. I realized this in kind of early 2023 where I felt like I was doing well, I felt like I was improving, but I felt like I wasn't performing at really important junctures. Like I had broken twice at Australs at this point, but I'd fallen out in the first out round both times, and I was like, am I just bad at performing under pressure? And you know, am I just like not getting it? And I spoke to Eugene, who is always a great person to talk about your debating troubles with if you ever encounter him. And he said to me, I think your problem is that you've specialized yourself too much. You have lost touch a bit with judging and rebutting because you never do it. And so sometimes you make really weird predictions about what people are going to say, or you have a strange intuition about what other people think. So you need to do more like speaking third, and you need to do more judging. And so I did, and I thought it was valuable. And I think that this is quite useful feedback for anyone who is maybe speaking a lot of first and finding themselves stagnating a bit. Perhaps the reason is that your sixth sense for forecasting how the debate will play out isn't as honed as it could be by using multiple perspectives. So maybe do that. Cool. It also makes you a better teammate to your responsive speakers, especially once you've done speaking. If you end up giving the reply at Australs and you're first, it's helpful to know what responsive speakers do and like what the differences between response and reply are. And it's also helpful to, if you're not speaking reply and you're just kind of helping them track to know what happens at what responsive speakers' mindsets are. So that's helpful. Finally, use your fiat, but don't be a rules lawyer. I think setup has this catch-22, which I always found exceedingly frustrating, which is you can easily undercook it. So you find people in situations where they will spend 45 seconds explaining that they have counter fiat because they're the negative team, and you know they're going to use their counter fiat, and they state a policy that they're going to use their counter fiat on. But they don't actually devote much time in the rest of the speech to explaining why that policy that they've counter fiated in is good. They sort of just say like, a classic example maybe is like in a social movement debate, being like, we would use our counter fiat on like women's shelters, domestic violence, which, you know, you're meant to hear that phrase and be like, well, that's obviously a good thing. I don't need to explain why that's better than what the affirmative teams said that they're going to do with their feminist capital. And they just undercook setup. And so they end up wasting 45 seconds explaining their fiat, modeling in a policy, blah, 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 going through that rigmarole, because that never ends up changing the result of the debate. But it's also, as I found, and I increasingly found more common in my own speaking, easy to overcook setup. Sometimes, and I think debates are getting weirder, I feel, like the topics are getting weirder. People end up in these really mired definitional clashes or clashes about what's true of fiat given the words of the motion. And you end up with second affirmative speakers or first negative speakers who devote 4 minutes or half of their speech to litigating some ridiculous battle about boutique interpretations of the debating manual. The thing that I realized was that even if you're right, assuming that you're quite good at debating, you'll probably be right more often than not when you overcook setup. That judges really hate awarding decisions based on clashes like this. And I think the reason is because, especially when you have to give it away, teams will obliterate you in general feedback to the CAs if you openly award a debate on the basis of a definitional clash. And so even if it is pivotal to their decision, they really don't want to do it. So most judges have, I think, a really strong bias against taking into account 4 minutes of fiat equivalent, or rules lawyering. And I think most people think it's kind of not in the spirit of the game. So it usually doesn't have that much value. Again, I guess my impulse is that it's important to have balance. To soul search about each piece of setup, non-argumentative material that you're doing, about whether you as a judge would find that material important, whether you'd be comfortable changing your call based on the analysis that you're about to set up. I think that unless it crosses the barrier of genuinely changing the result, it's not worth saying. Sometimes that means doing no setup at first, and that's fine too. I think people have a reflexive instinct that speeches need to have the setup, but sometimes they don't. Or sometimes we just waste time doing setup because the judge won't care anyway. So that's my take on Fiat setup rules. I have made many, many frustrating errors in this general terrain in my life, and I'm just over it, and I think you should just avoid making those mistakes. Cool. I'm done. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
What were Jordan Gibson's disagreements on speed? Were they
She
notable?
pretty much universally told me that I should speak fast. Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't asking a question, sorry.
That's okay. Okay, cool. The slides are on the motions are on